Hey guys, what is up? I am back. It is February 1st, the day that I am recording. Who knows when you're watching this? But with that being said, that means it is Black History Month. So we're gonna do it. We're gonna talk about Black books for Black History Month because it only makes sense. I want to talk about though why it's important for us to do this inside of the bookish community, because a lot of people are kind of like, they're all for wanting to talk about posting their quotes about MLK onto their Facebook page, but then when it comes to books, especially over on TikTok, people get super defensive, and the argument is always, well, how come I just can't read books that I enjoy? I don't care about color, all those different type of things. So before we get into the recommendations, I want to explain why it's important that we do this, not just all the time, but specifically like in February, why this is a really good time to intentionally seek out Black books, Black stories by Black authors. The first reason is because historically, just in general, whiteness has been the default, and then that transferred over into the bookish community, all the way into publishing. So from our editors to the actual stories we hear to the protagonist characters, all those kind of things, the default has always been white. And there's no way around that. You can lie to yourself about it if you want to, but that's just the truth. So my earring, this happens every video where my earrings always hit the mic. Anyways, so until we intentionally go to break out of what that default is, we're going to keep falling back onto that default, and things aren't going to change. And reading, especially even in fiction, is so important because it gives you such a wide variety of perspectives. It gives you, it helps you grow your capacity for empathy. It helps you see other people's viewpoints. It can reinforce like biases that you already had. It's so impactful. And a lot of people think that like, well, I don't read one book and then all of a sudden turn into a racist. Like, of course not. For some people that's true, but for most people it's more so like a building block. So I'm gonna take those off. It's more so like a building block. So let's say you're on the news and the news is portraying a certain stereotype about a group of people, and you also grew up around a household and a family where these stereotypes were kind of talked about, whether it was a joking manner or not, they were kind of talked about. But then also you go to school and those same stereotypes are kind of accepted as the norm, and then you go home and you read a book where these stereotypes are reinforced inside of that book, and those building blocks keep building on top of each other until before you know it, you're acting out on that unconscious bias on the actual person that stereotype is supposed to represent, right? So it's not like this big bang moment. It's building blocks, which is why it's important for us to look at the books that we are reading and intentionally diversify them, and intentionally make sure that we are reading stories of Black people by Black authors and doing the work. Okay, so that's why it's happening. That's why we're having these conversations. That's why we have these recommendations. And yes, you should be doing it all year round, but if you haven't been, why not do it in February? Why not be intentional about it? So I'm going to give you a couple of nonfiction recommendations if you kind of want to expand your knowledge on it and just grow as a person, unlearn some things, unlearn anti-Blackness. And this goes for whether you are Black or not. Very helpful. And I'm going to give you some fiction recommendations. Side note, most of them are fantasy because that's all I read. So in the description, I'll link to some book creators, some bookish creators who probably have more recommendations outside of fantasy, because that's all I read. It's one of my goals to get out to different genres, but here we are. So for the nonfiction, the first one that I want to suggest, particularly if you are not a person of color, is the book White Fragility. You've probably seen this title everywhere. It's on every bookshelf, but if you haven't read it, I will say this is a good starting point. And the reason why I say it's a good starting point is because the rest of the books that you're going to read are going to most likely challenge you. And if there are some biases already kind of embedded in you that you were unconscious of, those challenges are going to make you feel defensive, and you're going to want to push back and stuff like that. So White Fragility will help you kind of unpack what some of that defensiveness, where that comes from, so that when you do encounter it, you know what it is and you know how to do the work to kind of undo that, right? So that you can go into the next books like a little bit more clear-minded. So I say that is a good book to start. White Fragility, just unpacking that. The New Jim Crow is a good book that kind of explains how those foundational levels of segregation and racism have built up into our current systems right now. And I think this is a really good book. This is really important because when a lot of people think about racism and race relations, they have a very elementary idea about what that looks like. So it's kind of like, if you're not saying the N-word, or if you don't have a like white or black only sign, then it's not racism. So then people don't want to confront like systematic racism, or they don't want to confront like passive aggressiveness, different things like that, because in their minds they've kind of watered it down as not being racism. So The New Jim Crow, a good book. Don't Touch My Hair is, I personally liked it because it really speaks about the politics of hair, especially within the Black community, the culture of hair, and how that kind of impacts us and the way that we navigate socially throughout the world. Because, you know, it does impact us. It might seem like such a small thing, but it most definitely has a social impact. Cass, The Origins of Our Disconnects. That's a thick book. It's a thick book, but it's not unreadable. It's not too heavy, if that makes sense, like content wise, but it's still a really good book. And it's going to help you see new perspectives and change your mind and question things and challenge things a little bit more. And then Hood Feminism, I enjoyed it. It was more so of like, I felt like almost like a conversation between a Black woman and the other person who's reading it, about like the experience of being Black, navigating Black culture and non-Black culture, different things like that, and then understanding how feminism plays a role in that, and the difference between being intersectionality informed feminism versus just white feminism, which doesn't help people of color. So I think that was a good book. A lot of it was like conversational and stuff like that, which is something that I enjoyed, because I feel like it was, if you want to continue like on the work that you're doing, but like you needed to tone it down a little bit, especially if you are a Black woman, you just kind of like need some space to kind of digest things. I feel like this is a really good book for that. So with that being said, the fiction books, my all-time favorite, just a favorite book in general, is Their Eyes Were Watching God. I remember I read this for the first time in AP English, either 11th or 12th grade. I can't remember. That was so long ago. Anyways, I remember I read it, absolutely loved it. I loved it for the romance. I loved it for the character development, how we go through such a different span, like in such a short span of time though, you see like how culturally the character's landscape was changing, the grief, the reward, the joy, all of it. I did cry reading it, because it's a good book. It's a good book overall in general. And I did watch the movie. There were some changes made between the movie and the book, like most books are. So make sure you read the book as well. But I thought the movie was good too. Some people didn't like the movie with Halle Berry. I liked it. So that's one of them. Songs of Wrath and Ruin is a young adult fantasy book. And I enjoyed the world building inside of that book. The main character, the female main character protagonist, isn't necessarily my favorite person, but she's a good character, if that makes sense. Like, I wouldn't hang out with her if she was like an actual person, personality wise, but the character wise, she was great, and I think she needed to be who she was in order for the plot to progress. There is a little bit of romance in there. The romance happened really quick, but like I said, because of the world building and stuff like that and the magic system, I still enjoyed it. This is a series, so I think there's a part 2 that I haven't got around to yet, just because I'm not necessarily a huge fan of young adult, but still think it's a good book, and I'll probably get around to the second book eventually. Dream Nation, really good book, a really fun book, historical zombie fantasy type of thing. Read it around Halloween last year, and I thought it was a really good book. Fast paced. It did slow down a little bit in some places, but overall, great book. And then The Perishing, I hesitated recommending this because I have a love-hate relationship with this book. So it's technically considered a contemporary fantasy because it's set in like the real world, real historical context put into the book, very well researched, great book overall. But the ending had me so upset, and then there is no second part to this book. So I just feel like I have to make this caveat because you're gonna get to the ending, like it's a very slow paced book. I almost DNF'd it because I was like, I don't think I can do it. But once I got towards the middle, I was kind of invested in figuring out what this mystery was, and then by the end I was like, oh my goodness, I need to know what happens. And then it ends, it legit ends. It doesn't so part of me really loves it because I love that build up, and it had so much potential. Part of me hates it because I really wish there was a part 2, and like there was this huge build up for it to just really end, like for real. So that's up to you if you want to check it out or not, but I wanted to recommend it because I just feel like if a book can have such a strong emotional reaction, then it's probably a good book objectively. So and it is really poetically written, culturally rich, beautiful book, beautiful characters, strong characters. So I loved it. Those were my recommendations for this video. If you have some recommendations of Black authors, Black stories, put them in the comments, and like I said, I will put some of my favorite booktubers so that you can check out their recommendations, and I will see you in the next video.